Okay, we have to lower expectations now. I'm hoping it's going to be good. You'll be the judge of that. Well, it is a pleasure for me to be here today to talk about Arlington National Cemetery. Before we start, I want to make sure I have 2 handouts for everybody. So if you haven't received them, let's pass.
I'll do that.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody got, you got one?
One of the handouts is a map of Arlington Cemetery, which we use to kind of orient ourselves as we talk about the cemetery. And the other is the family tree of the Custis family, which is, of course, the property on which Arlington was established. And I think that this is part of the history of Arlington that a lot of people are not familiar with. So, we're going to cover that today. And I did live in Washington, D.C. From starting in 1985 through 1990. And while I was there, I did spend a year writing and researching a book on Arlington National Cemetery called Arlington National Cemetery Shrine to America's Heroes. It is now in its 3rd edition, and I am proud to say that for the past 26 years, it's been the best-selling book on Arlington at the cemetery itself. So I guess while I was researching the book, I visited the cemetery about 200 times. So I know it pretty well, up and down all those hills, walking through those rows of tombstones, looking for names that were familiar or unfamiliar to me, but wanting to discover it. So today we're going to learn about Arlington, and I'm going to get some help here from Boyle to help me with my slides. That's just go ahead. Take the next slide too. Okay, how many of you have been to Arlington National Cemetery? Very good. So many of you are familiar with it. And we know a lot about some of the story of Arlington, but I think there's a lot of the story that we don't know. This is the entrance to the cemetery. If you were to look at the map, let's go to the next one. If you look at the map that I just gave you, and it's a little bit fuzzy, I know, but when you look at the map, this is the entrance to the cemetery here, and when you look at that picture that we just saw, the Arlington House sits up on the hill up here. So as you come across the Potomac River, you're coming up this way, and then up on the hill is where you see Arlington House, and then John Kennedy's grave is right here. So this is, as we go through this, we'll talk about some of the different places in the cemetery that may be of interest, so that may orient you from your visit while you might have been there. Arlington's house, we know Arlington Cemetery was established in the Civil War. Most of us know that. But most of us don't realize that the rich history of Arlington actually starts with George Washington and his family. As we know, Washington was born and raised at Mount Vernon in Alexandria, Virginia. How many of you visited Mount Vernon? It's much the same. You'll see some similarities between the way Mount Vernon looks and the way Arlington House looks, and that's not a coincidence. That is intentional. When you go to and our story starts today with the marriage of George Washington and Martha Dandridge Custis. Martha Washington, they were married on January 6, 1759, and at the time, Martha Washington was considered the richest woman in the colonies. We were still obviously colonies back then, and she had inherited a great deal of money and land from her first husband who died, Daniel Custis, including 15,000 acres of land in Virginia and Maryland. So she was pretty well off. George married well. And Martha married well as well. They had a good family history together. When they got married, Martha had 2 young children. She had 4 children with Daniel Parke Custis, but 2 of her children died in infancy. And so by the time she married George Washington, she had 2 surviving children, and they were young. John Parke Custis, who was only 4 years old, and Martha Parke Patsy Custis, who was only 2 years old. So Washington kind of got an immediate family, right away, 2 young children in the family. And throughout his lifetime, John Parke Custis, this young man right there, watched his father manage the huge Mount Vernon estate. He saw what it took to manage a large estate, what it took to manage the dozens of slaves that worked at Mount Vernon, and how to handle crops and cattle, and the kind of business that is required to skillfully manage Mount Vernon. In 1778, 24-year-old John Parke Custis inherited, let's go back one, sorry. the young man here inherited 1,100 acres, sorry, from his natural father when he was just 24 years old. And that was 1,100 acres that was 15 miles north of Mount Vernon, which is today, of course, where Arlington Cemetery sits. But at the time, he invested in it. That was going to be his plantation. That was going to be his home someday. But in the meantime, of course, in 1776, we went to war against Great Britain for independence. And so, as Washington became commander of the Revolutionary Army, his stepson, John Parke Custis, served as an aide to him throughout that war. And it was during that war that he purchased this property, or he inherited this property north of Washington, 15 miles north of Washington. Unfortunately, in 1781, just around the time of the Battle of Yorktown, John Parke Custis, while he was serving with his stepfather, George Washington, developed what was called camp fever, and he died. It was probably tuberculosis or malaria or some disease like that, but at that time then he died. And of course, as any parents would be, George and Martha Washington were devastated by his death, as any parent would be. And John Parke Custis left behind a young widow and 4 children. If we look at our map, our family tree, I should have started this sooner. If you look at the top of that, you can see Daniel Parke Custis and Martha Dandridge Custis Washington. They were the parents of the 2 young children that Washington adopted, or didn't adopt, but raised when he married Martha Parke Custis. So the property, when John Parke Custis died, and his wife Eleanor, she decided that she would take the 2 younger children, and she and George would raise the 2 younger grandchildren of hers, and John Parke Custis's widow, Eleanor Calvert Custis, would raise the 2 older children. So Washington adopted those children in 1781. So now, here was George Washington. He is 49 years old, and Martha is 50 years old, and now they are getting ready to raise 2 young children. George Washington Parke Custis, who was his grandson, or his adopted son, was just 6 months old when George Washington adopted him. And his older sister, Eleanor Parke Custis, was, and you can see them here, were older, was 2 years old at the time. So now George and Martha were now raising 2 young children. The difference is now the war was over, and as the war ended, of course, George Washington eventually became President of the United States. So young George Washington Parke Custis, his son that he adopted, of course, just like his father, watched George Washington manage the large Mount Vernon estate, both in terms of how he manages the property, the resources on the property, and the slaves that worked on the property. George Washington Parke Custis saw his father doing these things. The only difference between what he saw and his father saw was, his natural father, was that at this time, George Washington was the President of the United States. So he was not only watching him manage Mount Vernon, but he was watching him as he was the leader of this new country. And so, and there was no Washington, D.C., there was no Capitol, there was no White House. And so the Mount Vernon essentially became the White House. This was the president's home. And so when ministers came from foreign countries, or congressmen and senators got together, they wanted to come to see Washington, they would come to Mount Vernon. So that was kind of like the southern White House, if you will. The Capitol was up in Philadelphia and then New York, and then but Washington would be often down in Mount Vernon, and so people came to see him down there. And this young man watched his grandfather as he not only managed his estate, but managed the country as well. So all that was going well until 1799, when George Washington died. And when George Washington died, George Washington Parke Custis, the young man who was named after him, was devastated. He was just 18 years old, and suddenly his father, the man he admired more than anyone in the world, died. And so he began believing that he was going to create a memorial, a monument to George Washington. saying that so people could see and appreciate him as not only the father of our country, but his father as well. And then in 1802, Martha Washington died. So then both George and Martha were buried on Mount Vernon estate, and young George Washington Parke Custis decided he wanted to buy Mount Vernon. He didn't inherit it, unfortunately. The property title went to George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington. And young Parke Custis wanted to buy that property from Bushrod Washington, but he would not sell it because he wanted, well, obviously it's a pretty nice place, and he had inherited it under the terms of George Washington's family estate. And so young George Washington Parke Custis started looking around and said, now what should I do now? And he of course knew that he owned 1,100 acres of land 15 miles north of Mount Vernon on the Potomac River, just like Mount Vernon is, and said, this is where I will build my estate. This is where I will build my plantation and my monument, my memorial to George Washington. And so that's what he did. He started in, next one. So as we look at this map, this is an 1820 map, and it'll help us. This is Washington, D.C., back in the early 19th century. You can see where the White House is. You can see where the Capitol is. A lot of this land now, the Lincoln Memorial sits about right here in the middle of the Potomac, but it filled it in a little bit since then. But he owned all this land over here. This was where the 1,100 acres that he purchased was. Coincidentally, by the early 1800s, now it had been decided that Washington, D.C., where Washington, D.C. was going to be, Virginia and Maryland had donated land to create the District of Columbia that was centered in the country at that point, north and south. And so he coincidentally and luckily had property now, very valuable property, right across the river from where the new federal capitol was being built. And so he set about to build his house. And he started in 1802, this mansion that we see today up on that hill. And while he had many resources, he had property, he had 200 slaves that he had inherited, he had other resources, he didn't have much cash. He was kind of cash poor. And so he couldn't build his house all at once. He had hired George Hadfield. George Hadfield was the architect that designed the United States Capitol building. And so now he had hired him to design the house that he was building that was going to be half his home and half of it a museum to George Washington. That was his goal. And so as he became a very successful farmer, mainly because he had developed two strands of very valuable sheep. That both the meat and the wool from those sheep were considered the finest in the country. And so he developed what we call Arlington Supreme sheep, and that's how he eventually made money. But as he was making money as a younger man, he would be spending it right away trying to collect more memorabilia about George Washington. And he ended up spending almost everything he made, he spent on memorabilia. He was obsessed with collecting it. He purchased everything he could, everything from axes and corn drills and battle flags, the tents that Washington used while he was in the Revolutionary War, brick molds, punch bowls, pocket telescope, umbrellas, even his deathbed. Custis had purchased from Bushrod, and his goal was to put them into his house and make this as a museum for George Washington. So when he started building the house, he built this north wing first, over here. And that was 6 rooms in the north wing, and that's where he lived, and he lived there with his new wife, there she is, Mary Lee Fitzhugh, and Custis were married in 1804. He was 23 and she was 16. Sorry, I lost my place here. So he was a little bit older than her, and she was quite young. When they first moved into the house in 1804, they were living only in that north wing of the house. Then in 1806, he built the south wing of the house, and then for 14 years, it was just those 2 wings, and the center was just a kind of a courtyard, a chicken yard or a farmyard, where the cattle and the chickens and stuff were raised, while he was trying to collect the money to finish his house. Which he did eventually in 1818, after it took 14 years to finish it. When the house was finished, it stretches 140 feet from the north end to the south end. So it's quite a large house. And one other thing that he wanted to do, when you look at those pillars on the portico there, they of course look like they're marble. They're not marble, they're stucco, and they're just painted that way, and they always were that way. But he made them 5 feet in diameter, much, much larger than they needed to be to hold up that portico. But he wanted them large so that people across the river in Washington, D.C. could see what a majestic home he had built there, and that this was going to be the museum honoring George Washington. And so everybody would be able to recognize it and know exactly where it was and what that was up on the hill across the Potomac. And so he set about then finishing his house and putting his museum together for the benefit of Washington. He hosted many, the rooms, these 2 rooms on this end, is where the museum was going to be. It was just 2 large rooms, and he stocked that full of Washington memorabilia, of everything that he could find that he had gathered about George Washington and put it there. And it did become what he intended. It became what we would call the Washington Monument today, but there was no Washington Monument. And so everybody that wanted to honor Washington would come up to his mansion. And of course he lived here till he died in 1857. So this was for the first half century of the 19th century where people honored George Washington. And if a head of state came from overseas to visit the country and they wanted to honor Washington, they would come up to the Capitol or to the Arlington House. And if they wanted, when senators and congressmen came, they would go up to there as well. Even the Marquis de Lafayette, who served with Washington during the Revolutionary War, visited from France in 1824, and he too came to the Arlington House to pay homage to George Washington. And while he was there, he gave Lafayette, Custis gave Lafayette Washington's umbrella and the sash that he wore while he was president during his inauguration. President Andrew Jackson came and visited in 1825, and he gave Jackson Washington's pocket telescope that he had. So he loved collecting stuff, but he also loved giving things away. He would take documents that George Washington signed, and he would tear the signatures off of them and hand them out as souvenirs to people as they came to visit. And as they stood up on the hill there, at that time, let's go to the next slide. I think the next slide will show, yes. So if we look at the map again, the house set up about right here. There was one bridge that went across the Potomac called the Long Bridge, and down here was some springs and kind of a park-like area. And it was very popular for people in D.C. if they wanted to get out of town to come across the Long Bridge and just do picnics and things down here. So George Washington Parke Custis would see people coming across the bridge or setting up down there having picnics, and he would then, because he was such a gregarious guy, he would tell his slaves to get out Washington's tents, and he'd drag those tents down to where the people were, and he'd set up the tents for them, and then he would come down with his fiddle under his arm, and then start telling stories about George Washington and playing the fiddle for them and regaling them with tales about Washington, because he was obviously enthusiastic about how he wanted to honor his father, but he also was just a gregarious guy and a pretty well-read guy. He was a playwright. He wrote a couple of plays. He was an artist. He painted several paintings that are still in his home. A couple of battle scenes from the Revolutionary War he had painted. So he was a very well-known local celebrity, if you will, in the D.C. area. Of course, he was George Washington's son, so that kind of gives you some celebrity status just in that, or his adopted son, I should say. So this is how Custis fulfilled his dream of creating this monument memorial to George Washington, and also being a successful plantation owner, because that's what he was, of these 1,100 acres that he was managing. In 1808, George Washington Parke Custis and his wife Mary had 4 children, but only one of them lived to adulthood, and that was Mary Anna Randolph Custis. She was born in the house in 1808, and as you can imagine, being an only child and being a young lady, an attractive young lady, and a very well-educated young lady. She spoke several languages, was very musical, traveled some, and so she was considered, quite a catch there in the D.C. area, and many men courted her in trying to gain her hand. But George Washington Parke Custis, obviously made a very important point to his daughter, that whoever you marry will be the person who's going to inherit this estate and is going to inherit the custody of this Washington collection. And so she always knew that that was going to be an important part of her life, taking over when her father had passed, that she would become, you know, the custodian of this memorial, and her husband would be a part of that as well. And so that was always in the back of everybody's mind as she was growing up. And then, of course, when people started courting her, her father said, I have one rule that you cannot do in selecting a husband. You cannot pick a military man. Because military men are never around. They're always being shipped off someplace, you know, serving someplace else and leaving you alone to raise the kids and take care of the house and take care of the family. Don't marry a military man. Well, so much for that. Because one of the men that was courting a young Mariana Custis was a second lieutenant who had just graduated from West Point by the name of Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee was from a very well-known family. His father, Richard Lighthorse Harry Lee, had been governor of Virginia for 2 terms. They were from Alexandria, the same place that Washington was from. They went to the same church as Washington. So the families were very well known to each other. And despite Parke Custis's desire not to have his daughter marry a military man, within the Custis household there were 3 votes. And between Mrs. Custis and Mariana, and voted one way, and George Washington Parke Custis voted the other way, so he lost. And of course, but of course he embraced Robert Lee as well. So so they got married in the Rose Garden at Arlington House on June 30th, 1831. Probably the most spectacular event that ever happened at Arlington House was the marriage of their only child and Robert E. Lee. I don't think I mentioned. Anybody know why it's called Arlington House? Was that? Well, did you raise your hand? It's called Arlington House because Custis wanted to name it Mount Washington, as an honor to George Washington, but his family convinced him to name it Arlington House after the Duke of Arlington, because it was the Duke of Arlington in Great Britain, back when we were a colony, that gave the land grants to the Custis family, and felt that it was more honorable to name it after him than to name it after George Washington. So that's why it was named Arlington House. So Robert E. Lee, of course, then, after they were married, sure enough, as a military man, he was often away from Arlington House. He was a member of the Army Corps of Engineers, and he was sent to St. Louis in 1837 to help dredge the harbor there at St. Louis. In 1846, he served under Winfield Scott in the Mexican War, where he distinguished himself as being brave and courageous. In 1852, he was appointed superintendent of West Point. So he was able to go back to his alma mater and serve as superintendent. And that was the one place that Mrs. Lee was able to join him.